The morning shift at St. Augustine Medical Center always began with fluorescent light and the scent of antiseptic. Ava Morales adjusted the badge clipped to her scrub top and studied her reflection in the glass of the medication cabinet. To anyone watching, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a new graduate nurse on her third week of orientation. Her dark hair was tied back in a practical bun. Her hands were steady. Her posture was straight without looking stiff. "Relax," one of the senior nurses had told her on the first day. "You're safe here." Ava had smiled politely. Safe. She had learned long ago that safety was not a place. It was a calculation. The emergency department was already busy. A construction worker with a crushed finger, a toddler with a fever, an elderly man complaining of chest pain. Monitors beeped in uneven rhythm like a strange mechanical symphony. Ava moved through it all. Before I continue the story, I'd like to ask you to press the subscribe button if you enjoy our community stories about the people of the United States. Don't forget to hit the like button as well. Please leave a comment and let us know where you're watching this video from. And if you have any experiences you'd like to share, feel free to write them in the comments below. All right, let me continue the story. With a quiet efficiency that surprised even her preceptor, Denise. "You ever worked trauma before?" Denise had asked during a lull. "Clinical rotations," Ava replied. That was true. It just wasn't the whole truth. Before she had ever memorized drug dosages or learned how to chart electronically, Ava had memorized the weight of a rifle. She had learned to clear rooms in buildings where dust floated in shafts of foreign sunlight. She had learned how quickly a normal day could become chaos. But no one here needed to know that. She had left that life behind when she took off her uniform for the last time, when she boarded a plane home, when she told herself she wanted something different, something that healed instead of destroyed. A crash from the waiting room interrupted her thoughts. Not unusual. Chairs scraped all the time. Patients argued. Families panicked. Then came a sound she had not heard in 3 years, but her body recognized before her mind did. A sharp, percussive crack. Not a chair. Not a tray. A gunshot. For half a second, the emergency department froze. The world seemed to inhale and hold its breath. Another shot followed. Closer. Glass shattered near the reception desk. Screams erupted, high and raw, slicing through the air. Denise grabbed Ava's arm. "What is that?" "Firecrackers." Ava didn't answer. Her pupils narrowed. Her shoulders lowered slightly, instinctively shifting her center of gravity. Pop, pop, pop. 3 shots in rapid succession. Not one shooter. At least 2. The pattern told her that much. "Active shooter," Ava said calmly. The words landed like stones. Someone in the hallway shouted, "He's got a gun." Panic exploded. Patients tried to stand, for lines tangling. A mother dropped her purse while reaching for her child. A stretcher overturned with a metallic screech. The orderly near the trauma bay bolted toward the back exit. Ava didn't move. Not yet. She listened. Footsteps. Heavy. Fast. Shouting male voices. Another burst of gunfire. Plaster rained down from the ceiling near the triage desk. Denise was breathing too fast. "We have to hide. We have to lock the doors." "Yes," Ava said evenly. "Help the ambulatory patients to the supply room. It has one entrance." "What about you?" "I'll cover triage." It wasn't a suggestion. It was command. Denise hesitated only a second before nodding, pulled along by the authority in Ava's voice. The front entrance doors slammed open. 2 men in dark hoodies stormed in, faces partially concealed by masks. One held a handgun. The other carried something longer, an AR-style rifle. They were young, too young, but their eyes were empty in the way Ava remembered. The rifle swung across the waiting area. Another shot. A man near the vending machines collapsed. The screaming intensified. Ava stepped behind the triage counter, lowering herself just enough to reduce her profile. Her heart rate had increased, but not wildly, not uncontrollably. It settled into something familiar, focused. One shooter moved toward the hallway leading deeper into the ER. The other stayed near the entrance, firing intermittently into the ceiling and walls, hurting people like terrified animals. They weren't random. They were pushing toward the main treatment area, toward the highest concentration of patients. Ava's jaw tightened. If they reached the trauma bays, there would be nowhere to run. She scanned quickly. Improvised weapons. Fire extinguisher mounted near the desk. Metal 4-poles. A rolling stool. Distance to shooter near hallway. Approximately 30 feet. Line of sight partially obstructed by overturned chairs. Her mind built the geometry automatically. A stretcher with a post-op patient was abandoned in the corridor. The woman on it was groaning, disoriented. The shooter with the handgun saw her. He stepped forward, raising the weapon. Ava moved. She vaulted over the lower section of the triage counter in a single fluid motion, landing low and controlled. Her sneakers barely made a sound. The shooter turned at the movement. Too late. Ava grabbed the nearest 4-pole and swung it with both hands, aiming not for his head, but for his wrist. Impact. The gun discharged into the ceiling as his grip faltered. She closed distance, immediately driving her shoulder into his torso. They hit the floor hard. He was stronger than he looked, but he was sloppy. He tried to bring the gun back up. Ava trapped his wrist against the tile, pivoting her weight across his forearm, a technique drilled into muscle memory years ago. He screamed as the bone shifted under pressure. She twisted. The weapon clattered away. The second shooter shouted from the waiting room, "Ethan!" Rifle fire erupted again. Bullets tore into the nurse's station, sending splinters into the air. Ava rolled behind an overturned stretcher, dragging the first shooter with her as partial cover. Her breathing remained steady. Think. The rifle wielder was advancing. 30 feet. 25. She shoved the disarmed shooter toward the hallway wall and kicked the handgun beneath a supply cart. The rifle appeared at the corridor entrance. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, confusion flickered across his face. She didn't look like a threat, just a nurse in light blue scrubs. He fired. Ava dropped flat. The bullet punched through the wall behind her. She grabbed the fire extinguisher from its bracket and yanked the pin free. As he stepped closer, adjusting his aim downward, she surged upward and discharged the extinguisher directly into his face. A blinding cloud of white powder engulfed him. He coughed violently, stumbling back, vision obscured. Ava closed the distance before he could recover. She drove the heavy metal canister into the side of his knee. The joint buckled. He fell sideways, rifle skidding across the floor. Ava kicked it away with controlled force, sending it under the nurse's station. He reached for a secondary weapon at his waistband. She seized his wrist mid-draw and twisted, forcing him onto his stomach. Her knee pressed between his shoulder blades. She locked his arm high behind his back. "Drop it," she said quietly into his ear. He resisted. She increased pressure incrementally, precise, surgical. The knife fell from his hand. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Police. The first shooter groaned from the hallway, trying to crawl. Ava rose and moved to him in 3 strides. She used a cable from a portable monitor to bind his wrists behind his back, tight and efficient. The second shooter lay gasping, still half-blinded. She stepped back, scanning for additional threats. Silence, except for crying, and the distant echo of approaching boots. Her heart began to pound harder now, not from fear, but from the release of it. Denise emerged slowly from the supply room, eyes wide. "Oh my God," she whispered. Patients peeked from behind overturned furniture. A child sobbed into his mother's chest. Security guards rushed in, weapons drawn, followed seconds later by uniformed officers who took control of the suspects. "Ma'am, step back," one officer ordered. Ava lifted her hands calmly and retreated. Only then did she notice the blood on her sleeve. Not hers. The man near the vending machines was still down. Training shifted. Not combat now. Medicine. She knelt beside him, pressing gauze to the wound. "Sir, can you hear me?" Her voice was steady again, but different, gentler. "Stay with me." Around her, the emergency department transformed into something surreal. Shattered glass glittering on the floor, overturned chairs, white extinguisher powder drifting like snow. Denise stared at her. "Ava, how did you—" Ava didn't look up. "I need a crash cart," she said. "Now." Denise moved automatically. Within minutes, the ER staff were doing what they were trained to do, stabilizing, triaging, working, but every so often, someone glanced at Ava with a new expression. Not just gratitude, recognition. As paramedics wheeled the wounded towards surgery, and officers led the shooters away in handcuffs, one detective lingered. "You handled yourself like you've done that before," he said carefully. Ava met his gaze. There it was. The moment she had tried to avoid since her first day in scrubs. "I have," she replied. He waited. She hesitated only briefly. "United States Army," she said. "2 tours." The detective's eyebrows lifted. "Combat medic?" Ava shook her head once. "Infantry." The word hung between them. Across the room, Denise stared openly now. The sirens faded. The immediate danger was over. But something else had begun, because the hospital staff were no longer looking at her like a new nurse finding her footing. They were looking at her like something else entirely. Outside, news vans were already pulling into the parking lot. Inside, Ava removed her blood-stained gloves and dropped them into a biohazard bin. Her hands were steady again, but deep in her chest, something she had buried years ago had just woken up, and it was not ready to go back to sleep. The first patrol officers had barely finished sweeping the building when the second wave began. Ava was kneeling beside the man who had been shot near the vending machines, applying steady pressure while respiratory therapy prepared to intubate. Her focus had narrowed again to pulse, breath sounds, blood loss. The world felt contained, manageable. Then the automatic doors at the ambulance bay exploded inward. The sound was not as sharp as gunfire, but violent enough to snap every head toward the back entrance. 3 more men rushed in, not teenagers this time. Older, organized, armed. One carried a shotgun. Another had a compact rifle. The third held a handgun, but moved with clear purpose, scanning corners the way someone trained would. This was not panic. This was coordination. One of the officers near the nurses' station shouted, "Additional shooters." Gunfire erupted again, deeper inside the ER. Ava's stomach dropped, not in fear, but in realization. The first 2 hadn't been the main attack. They had been a diversion. The officer closest to the ambulance bay went down almost instantly, struck in the shoulder before he could return fire. The remaining officers scrambled for cover behind thick support columns. Patients screamed again. The fragile comm shattered completely. The shotgun blast tore through the glass doors of Trauma Room 2. The organized shooter, the one scanning corners, spotted the cluster of staff trying to evacuate patients toward radiology. He raised his weapon. Ava moved before the thought fully formed. "Down!" she shouted. Her voice cut through the chaos like a command on a battlefield. Several nurses dropped instinctively. The shot rang out overhead, embedding in the ceiling instead of flesh. The man Ava had been treating groaned weakly. She grabbed his stretcher and shoved it hard, angling it behind a concrete pillar. "Stay with him," she barked to a resident physician who looked frozen. But stay with him. Authority again. No room for debate. The resident obeyed. Ava scanned quickly. 3 shooters. 1 near ambulance bay providing suppressive fire. 1 advancing toward trauma rooms. 1 covering the corridor leading to imaging. They were corralling people again, but this time more strategically. Her pulse quickened, not out of panic but calculation. They weren't just shooting randomly. They were pushing survivors toward the central hallway, toward the surgical wing. A memory surfaced uninvited. Insurgents driving civilians into confined corridors before detonating secondary devices. Her blood ran cold. Was there more? Ava dropped low and crawled toward the nurse's station where one of the wounded officers had taken cover. He was clutching his shoulder, blood soaking through his uniform. "I need your radio," she said. He stared at her, confused. "Now." He handed it over with shaking fingers. She pressed transmit. "This is Nurse Morales in the ER. Multiple additional shooters. Coordinated movement toward surgical wing. Possible secondary objective." There was static, then a strained voice. "Units en route. Hold position, if able. Hold position." She almost laughed. Another blast from the shotgun shattered a supply cabinet. A nurse cried out as glass sliced her forearm. Ava crawled to her, dragging her behind the desk. "Apply pressure," Ava instructed, wrapping gauze tight around the wound. "Keep it elevated." The nurse nodded, sobbing. The shooter near imaging advanced further down the corridor. If they reached surgery, there were anesthetized patients in operating rooms, completely defenseless. Ava's jaw tightened. She could not let that happen. She leaned toward the injured officer. "Can you fire one-handed?" He grimaced but nodded. "Cover the ambulance bay entrance. Keep his head down." "What are you doing?" he demanded. "Redirecting them." Before he could argue, she moved. She slid across the floor toward the overturned stretcher where she had kicked the rifle earlier. It was still lodged beneath the counter. She reached for it. Stopped. No, not yet. She was not here as a soldier. She was here as a nurse. But nurses protect their patients. Another burst of gunfire echoed from the hallway leading to surgery. They were getting closer. Decision made. She pulled the rifle free. The weight felt familiar. Too familiar. Her breath slowed automatically. Safety off. She did not stand fully upright. She stayed low, using the counter as partial cover. The shooter advancing towards surgery stepped into view. He hadn't seen her. He was focused on the locked double doors ahead, firing at the handle. Ava exhaled. 1 controlled shot. The bullet struck his thigh. He collapsed with a scream, weapon clattering away. The shotgun wielder swung toward the sound. Ava ducked as pellets tore into drywall above her. The injured officer returned fire from behind the pillar, forcing the shotgun blast to go wide. "Back!" the organized shooter shouted to his team. "Fall back!" But they weren't retreating out of fear. They were adjusting. The third shooter grabbed something from his vest and hurled it down the corridor. It clattered across tile. Small. Cylindrical. Ava's blood iced over. "Grenade!" she yelled. She didn't wait to see if it was lethal or flash. She lunged toward it, snatched it up, and hurled it back around the corner it had come from, diving flat as it detonated. A blinding flash filled the hallway. A thunderous bang shook the walls. Flash bang. Her ears rang, but she had shielded her eyes just in time. The returning blast disoriented the shooters instead. The shotgun wielder stumbled backward, cursing. Police reinforcements stormed through the main entrance at that exact moment, drawn by the renewed gunfire. "Drop your weapons." The organized shooter fired wildly toward the incoming officers. Ava rolled toward the fallen rifleman she had shot earlier in the leg. He was conscious, trying to crawl away despite the bleeding. She kicked his weapon farther out of reach and pressed her knee into his injured thigh, not enough to worsen the wound fatally, but enough to immobilize him. "Don't," she warned. He glared up at her through watering eyes. "You're just a nurse." Ava's expression didn't change. Not just. The hallway erupted again as police exchanged fire with the remaining attackers. The shotgun wielder was struck first, collapsing near the ambulance bay. The organized shooter attempted to retreat toward imaging, but found himself pinned between converging officers. Within seconds, he dropped his weapon. Silence fell slowly this time, broken by groans, crying, the metallic scent of gunpowder mixed with blood and antiseptic. Ava remained kneeling on the wounded attacker until officers physically pulled him away and cuffed him. Only then did the shaking begin. Not in her hands, deeper, in her chest. The aftermath was worse than the fight. It always was. She stood and surveyed the damage. Ceiling tiles shattered, walls pockmarked with bullet holes, equipment destroyed, and people, one officer critically wounded, 2 civilians shot, multiple staff injured by shrapnel and debris, but the surgical wing doors remained intact. No attackers had reached the operating rooms. Denise approached slowly, tears streaking her face. "You picked up a rifle." It wasn't accusation. It was disbelief. They were heading for surgery. Ava replied. Denise looked down the corridor toward the double doors. Understanding dawned. If they'd gotten in there. Ava nodded once. The detective from earlier reappeared, this time flanked by tactical officers. "You again," he said quietly. "Yes." "You saved lives." She didn't answer. Paramedics moved through the department, transporting both victims and attackers under heavy guard. The organized shooter locked eyes with her as he was led away. Not fear, recognition. He had seen her move, seen her training. "You military?" he asked hoarsely. She didn't respond. He gave a faint, bitter smile. "Thought so." The doors closed behind him. Outside, the media frenzy had doubled. Helicopters circled overhead. Reporters shouted questions at anyone in scrubs who emerged. Inside, administrators began gathering staff for headcounts and statements. But beneath the surface, something unsettled Ava. This hadn't felt random. The diversion, the coordinated push towards surgery, the flashbang. This was more than rage. It was tactical. As she helped transfer the wounded officer onto a gurney, she asked quietly, "Has anyone checked the parking garage?" The detective turned. "Why?" "They advanced in 2 waves," she said. "The first drew attention. The second pressed inward. If there's a third component, it won't be loud." His expression shifted. He spoke into his radio immediately. Minutes later, bomb squad units were dispatched. An hour after that, they found it. An improvised explosive device inside a stolen vehicle parked near the oxygen supply line outside the surgical wing. Armed, timed. If detonated, it would have crippled the hospital's infrastructure and killed dozens. The detective found Ava sitting alone in an empty trauma room when he received confirmation. "You were right," he said. She closed her eyes briefly. Of course she was, because she had seen tactics like this before, just not on American soil. "You may have prevented something catastrophic," he added. Ava stared at the floor. "I was trying to prevent surgery from being overrun," she said softly. "You did more than that." Maybe, but the cost of instinct returning was heavy. Around her, colleagues whispered. News spread quickly. The new nurse who fought back. The veteran who saved the hospital. She hadn't wanted this. She had wanted anonymity, healing, normalcy. Instead, the war had followed her home. And now the entire city knew her name. As evening approached, federal agents began arriving because coordinated attacks on civilian infrastructure triggered larger investigations. The detective lingered once more before she was called into formal questioning. "This wasn't random," he said quietly. "We're looking at extremist coordination." Ava met his eyes. "I know. Do you think they'll try again?" She considered the shattered ER, the bomb in the garage, the calculated movement towards surgery. "Yes," she said finally. "Why?" "Because they didn't expect to fail." The detective absorbed that in silence. Outside the hospital windows, camera lights flickered like distant lightning. Inside, the emergency department was closed temporarily, patients diverted elsewhere. Ava removed her scrub jacket, now stiff with dried blood and extinguisher residue. Her reflection in the darkened glass looked less like a nurse now, more like the soldier she had tried to leave behind. The rising action had only begun, because if this attack had been part of something larger, then today was not the end. It was an opening move. The hospital reopened 48 hours later. Administrators called it resilience. News anchors called it courage. Politicians called it an attack on the city. Ava called it unfinished. Uniformed officers stood at every entrance. National news vans still idled across the street. Inside, maintenance crews patched bullet holes and replaced shattered glass, but the air felt different, charged, watchful. The emergency department hummed again, though quieter than before. Staff moved with forced steadiness. Every loud sound drew flinches. Every unfamiliar face lingered a second too long in the corner of someone's eye. Ava had been placed on mandatory administrative leave. She came back anyway, not to work a shift, to check something. The detective, Mark Reynolds, met her near the nurses' station. They identified the attackers, he said without preamble. 3 were part of a domestic extremist cell. The 2 younger ones, recruited online. The older man, leader, prior military washout, obsessive about system collapse. Ava absorbed it quietly. "And the device in the garage?" she asked. "Professional level construction." He replied. "Someone trained them. We're tracking communications. There may be others." There it was, the word that kept her awake at night. Others. "I want access to the original security footage," Ava said. Reynolds studied her. "You're not on duty." "I know. You've done enough." "No," she said evenly. "I stopped what I could see." He hesitated, then motioned her toward a temporary command room set up in administration. They reviewed hours of footage, entrance angles, parking garage feeds, ambulance bay cameras. Ava leaned forward as the screen replayed the second wave of attackers entering through the ambulance doors. "Pause," she said. Reynolds froze the frame. In the reflection of the glass, behind the shooters, there was movement, a shadow, a vehicle pulling away too quickly. "Can you enhance that?" she asked. Tex adjusted contrast. The vehicle became clearer. A dark utility van. No plates visible. Reynolds frowned. "We thought that was a random car fleeing." "It wasn't random," Ava said. "Look at the timing." The van exited precisely 30 seconds after the second wave breached the ER. Too synchronized. "That's your missing piece," she added quietly. "Command and control." Reynolds exhaled slowly. Within hours, traffic cameras across the city were being cross-referenced. They found it 3 districts away, abandoned, but not empty. Inside were maps, schematics, and a tablet still powered on. Ava wasn't told the details immediately, but she saw it in Reynolds' face when he returned that evening. "They weren't just targeting the hospital," he said. She didn't ask. 3 other locations, he continued. Staggered timing. The hospital was first. Chaos multiplier. "What stopped the others?" she asked. "The hospital didn't fall," he said. "They were waiting for confirmation of mass casualties. When that didn't happen, they hesitated." Ava felt the weight of that settle. If surgery had been breached, If the device had detonated, the city would be telling a different story. Reynolds' phone buzzed sharply. He answered, listened. His expression hardened. They just tracked a signal from the tablet, he said after hanging up. Remote login attempt. Someone realized we recovered it. Location? Ava asked. Warehouse district. About 10 minutes from here. 10 minutes. Reynolds was already calling tactical units. Ava stood. You're not coming, he said immediately. She met his eyes. Those men inside that warehouse, she said calmly, were trained by someone who understands layered attacks. They'll have exits, fallback plans. That's why I have SWAT. And if they split, she pressed. If they run toward civilian areas. He hesitated. She didn't raise her voice. I don't want a badge, she said. I want to help you think like they do. He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. You stay behind the perimeter, he said firmly. She didn't promise. The warehouse stood near abandoned rail lines, rust bleeding into concrete. Police vehicles surrounded the block silently. Ava remained beside the mobile command truck, headset pressed to one ear as Reynolds relayed information. Thermal shows 2 heat signatures, an officer reported. Only 2. Reynolds asked. Affirmative. Ava felt a chill. That's wrong, she murmured. Reynolds glanced at her. Why? Cells don't shrink under pressure, she said. They disperse. As if on cue, a secondary explosion rocked the rear of the building, not outward but inward. A diversion blast. Smoke billowed from a side entrance. Movement, someone shouted over the radio. 2 figures bolted from the back exit, opposite the main police concentration. Exactly as she feared. They're splitting, Ava said. Reynolds swore and redirected units. 1 suspect was tackled near the tracks. The other sprinted toward a nearby community health clinic, smaller, less guarded. Ava's pulse surged. The clinic, minimal security, full waiting room at this hour. She didn't wait for permission. She ran. Her lungs burned as she cut across the lot, boots pounding pavement. She could hear sirens redirecting, but they were seconds behind. The suspect reached the clinic doors first. He fired once into the air to scatter bystanders and forced his way inside. Ava reached the entrance moments later. People were pouring out, screaming. She pushed against the current. Inside, the waiting room was chaos. The man stood near reception, weapon raised, shouting incoherently about betrayal and collapse. He wasn't calm like the others had been. He was unraveling, more dangerous. A nurse crouched behind the desk, shielding a child. The gunman paced erratically, finger tight on the trigger. Ava stepped into view, slowly, hands visible. Hey, she called evenly. His head snapped toward her. Stop, he shouted. She stopped. You don't want to do this, she said calmly. Shut up. Police sirens grew, louder outside. His breathing quickened. Cornered animals were unpredictable. You were supposed to win, she said softly. He faltered at that. They were supposed to overwhelm us, break the system. His jaw clenched. They failed, she continued. And now you're alone. He shook his head violently. No, we had a plan. You still do, she said. Walk out of here alive. His grip trembled. Ava took 1 slow step forward. Don't, he screamed. She froze again. You think this proves something? She asked gently. Shooting patients? Children? He looked toward the child behind the desk. His hand wavered. This was the moment. Not force. Choice. You don't have to be the last one who makes it worse, she said quietly. Tears welled in his eyes. Rage and despair tangled together. The sirens were right outside now. Officers were positioning. But if he panicked, she shifted her weight, subtly, ready. He squeezed his eyes shut. The gun lowered a fraction. That was enough. Ava closed the distance in 2 strides. She seized his wrist, pivoted under his arm, and drove him off balance. The weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as she twisted it free. They hit the floor hard. She pinned him face down just as officers flooded the room and secured him. Silence fell again. Heavy, breathing, footsteps. Reynolds rushed inside. "You okay?" he demanded. Ava nodded once, rising slowly. The suspect sobbed as he was cuffed. The waiting room erupted into quiet applause, not loud, not triumphant, relieved. Outside, flashing lights painted the street red and blue. Hours later, the city exhaled. All connected suspects were in custody. No secondary attacks occurred. The network had fractured. Reynolds stood beside Ava on the clinic steps as dawn began to break. "You crossed the perimeter," he said. "Yes." He studied her. "You saved them." She stared at the horizon. "I stopped one man," she replied. "The system held." He nodded slowly. "You going back to nursing?" A faint smile touched her lips. "I never left." Weeks passed. The hospital restored full operations. Security protocols changed permanently. Staff received active threat training, and Ava returned to her shift, not as a myth, not as a headline, as a nurse. Patients still asked occasionally, "Are you the one from the news?" She would shrug gently. "I work here," she'd say. "That's all." But something had changed inside her. She no longer resented the soldier she had been. She understood now. The two halves of her were not enemies. They were continuity, healing, and protection. On her first full night back, Denise approached quietly. "I'm glad you're here," she said. Ava looked around the busy ER, monitors beeping, families waiting, controlled chaos restored. "Me too," she replied. A trauma alert sounded overhead. New patient inbound. Life moving forward. Ava grabbed gloves and stepped toward the bay. Not because she had to prove anything, not because cameras were watching, but because when the line between harm and healing threatened to break, she knew exactly where she belonged, on the side that held.